Hi, and welcome to Faith, Hope, and Love During an Election. I am so happy to have my friend and fellow Inc., a creative collective, which is our writing guild member, here with me today. And Amy Julia Becker is the author of 4 books, including White Picket Fences, which we'll talk about today, and which is celebrating its 2-year birthday tomorrow. And that book is ever more timely than it even was when it was first published. So I'm delighted, Amy Julia, that you're here today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
You bet. You bet. Well, let's start. I would love to hear, I love hearing people's stories about how they sort of came to be the political agents they are in the world. What kind of parts of your story shaped you and helped you to see the importance of being involved, at a local level, on a global level. Talk a little bit about your formation.
Yeah, so I grew up in a family where my parents were definitely politically involved, but not activists and pretty conservative. But I remember very distinctly early on talking with my dad, who was a Republican, like registered Republican, always voted Republican, and my aunt, his sister, who was a Democrat and always voted for the Democrats. And I remember talking to my dad because I'm like, you and Aunt Jane, like, you want the same things in the world.
Hmm.
And he's like, exactly. We just disagree about the best way to get there. But they did have a sense of like the common good and that politics is a way to vote towards the common good. And they disagreed about the best way for that to be enacted. But that really shaped me in terms of, I think, both an openness to both political parties, an awareness that people could have the same intentions and disagree about how to get there. And then in recent years, I would say also some measure of like, I'm not sure that's the case right now, that we actually agree on what the common good is or what our goals are as kind of a civic body. It does not seem to me that the parties always have the same goal in mind and just different ways to get there. I think we'd have more interesting discussions and debates if that were the case. Like we all agree that we want, whether it's like we all agree we want healthcare and we disagree about how to get it, or we all agree that we want people to be able to immigrate to this country, but we want to be careful about protecting our borders and the citizens who are already here. We don't seem to be having those conversations and disagreeing. Anyway, but that was like really formative to me, recognizing that the place where I want to be involved in debate and disagreement is on like the methods, but I also want to be aligned with people across the political aisle who have the same goals for our civic engagement and involvement in mind. That said, I would also say that I've been someone who's thought pretty like nationally, much more than I have known what's going on like a state and local level when it comes to politics. And it's only been probably in the last 10 years that I've been beginning to get more aware of what it would mean to be involved locally and understand what's going on in my state. And it's kind of ironic because that's where, of course, we have so much more like actual influence. And I've been convicted by that and just really beginning to try to understand what's at play here, who's working on different issues and things, and how can I be involved.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Well, I've had the same experience of feeling convicted just over the last few years, actually, to look with much more intention and with more imagination at what's happening in my local community. I think I did in the past sort of think, well, if we have a good president and we have, good laws on the national level, then I don't really have to think about. But I've kind of flipped that in my mind, honestly. Like I think it's so much more important for me to find ways to be engaged locally. But I want to talk about the White Picket Fences. Again, happy birthday to that wonderful book.
Thank you.
Um, I'm so glad it's in the world. I would love, I know some of the backstory about getting that book published and writing that book. Why don't you describe what the book is, and then let's walk through that a little bit, like what that timeline looked like and some of the obstacles that you had, and then also the relevancy of that book in this political and national moment.
Yeah, so White Picket Fences is a book that I'll read the subtitle. I have it here. Turning Towards Love in a World Divided by Privilege. So it's a book about me reflecting. It's a memoir, but me reflecting on being an educated, married, white, affluent woman, Christian woman in our nation, and reckoning with what that means and the ways in which that has given me unearned social advantages that I didn't always recognize were unearned social advantages. So, how did I come to recognize that? How did I come to understand the harm that those unearned advantages did both to me and to other people, and to my community, as well as to communities that I've been cut off from? And then, what would it look like to actually participate in healing, not just to stay kind of wallowing in the grief or the shame or guilt of that, social divisions. But I backed my way into that. I mean, I'm not sure that many white people sign up to talk about privilege. Especially, again, I come from this like kind of conservative, don't rock the boat type of family and background. And I have never, well, that's not true. When I'd written this book, like I'd never been involved in any activist causes and was, pretty. I mean, I remember talking to my husband about it and saying, I'm not an activist. And he was like, well, you're just a very polite activist. But there is just this sense of like Yankee thrift and decorum and politeness and whatever. So I started out writing a book about my children, reading children's books out loud to them. But one of the things that happened as I was writing that book is I was writing about an experience of reading chapter books out loud to our kids and recognizing that I only was reading books with white characters. And knowing that I really believed in my own life and for them that I wanted books not just to be mirrors, but also doors. And I wasn't giving them doorways. And so that caused this reflection on all sorts of areas of my life. In what way is the fact that we live in a predominantly white and affluent town, or that we send them to these types of schools, like how am I doing that same thing, not just with the books on our bookshelf, but in all areas or multiple areas of our lives? And so it led to a very different book that honestly I would never have set out to write. So that's what I mean by I kind of backed my way into it. And then I found that it took me over a year to write a proposal for that book. And then I found a lot of publishers who either said, this doesn't go far enough, like you're not actually pushing far enough towards action on behalf of breaking down some of these social divisions that you're talking about, or you're not qualified to write this book because you're a white person, which has some merit to it. But I also think we need some white voices in the conversation if we're going to have it. And then I also had publishers who basically said, yeah, we just don't touch that. Like, come back to me with your next idea, but let's keep it in a more safe space, kind of safe Christian spiritual space. And so then finally, and I remember this so distinctly because Nav Press was really interested in the book. And we arranged to have a conversation and didn't even recognize it at the time that we put a conversation on the calendar for the day after the 2016 presidential election. Mm-hmm. And all of us were surprised, as I think most of the nation was, that President Trump had been elected. And it felt really clear right then, no matter how you had voted, that a book about the ways in which we are divided in this country from one another, and the ways in which we might consider turning towards love instead of fear. I actually wrote a blog post shortly thereafter that ended up being kind of incorporated into the book about trusting that love is stronger than fear. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? So that's kind of the lead up to 2016 being committed to writing this book as far as like actually having a publisher. And then it came out really 2 years after that in 2018.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And have you seen since the murder of George Floyd and so much more conversations are elevated and more in the sort of commonly undertaken by white people about dismantling white supremacy and about racial injustice and all those things. Have you seen a renewed interest in the book? I know the book, it was so powerful when it came out, but I wonder if it's had a resurgence in people finding it in this, particular moment.
Yeah, so I'll say two things on that. One, yes. I mean, I was really actually surprised because in my mind, as someone who's been following along pretty intentionally and closely with some of the other deaths of Black and Brown people over the course of these past couple of years, in my mind, like the book didn't, nothing happened as far as sales of the book after Breonna Taylor was killed. Nothing happened after Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And so I was very surprised after George Floyd was killed that this book actually did. I mean, it sold out on Amazon, and I was like, oh, okay, I wasn't looking for that. So I do think that was a time of like a national reckoning and consciousness that had not been the case really before, where there were these little, circles of people or scattered individuals who would say, hey, I'm giving this to my mom, or I want to talk about this in my book club or whatever. But there was more, and not just my book, but plenty of other books that also, the New York Times bestseller list in early June was remarkable in terms of clearly showing that people wanted to learn more. The other thing I'll say about this book, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of being like woke, and literally the idea of waking up. And I think that there are a lot of, especially people who are like me, so who come from a place of social privilege. So that what that affords is the luxury of choosing whether or not to engage in social conflict. If you're on the side of oppression and injustice, like if you're stuck in that place, it's like I don't have a choice but to engage in this because it's my daily experience. Whereas I think for people like me, it's relatively easy to withdraw. And now I think for whatever reason, George Floyd, his murder was this moment of awakening for a lot of people. But here's the thing: if you have woken up late, it's really disorienting. It's often a little embarrassing, and you are not ready to move quickly. I mean, if you just physically think about the experience of waking up and knowing that you're late, but also like I was just sleeping deeply, or even I was sleeping restlessly, whatever it is. So I've been thinking about that kind of metaphor a lot. And I think White Picket Fences is designed for people who are just waking up to the problems of injustice in our country, to reckoning with a history of white supremacy, who also really want to honor the goodness of American democracy, who want to be grateful for what has happened in our country, while also reckoning with the terrible things and this history of violence and oppression. I mean, that would be my hope, is that when I wrote the book, but also even still now, for people who are like me and who are feeling like, okay, I feel like I'm a little bit late to this, but I do actually want to wake up and I want to get involved, but like I haven't even had my coffee yet. So what do I do? That's how I'm thinking about it.
I think too, it makes me think of the story you told about your dad and your aunt having, believing in the common good, but having different perspectives. I think in this book, you do welcome all kinds of different readers. It's not, there's no sort of like secret club you have to be in to read this book and understand it. It really is welcoming to people, regardless of sort of their political convictions or their life experiences. And so it's funny. I think that that story is really kind of appropriate to the book as well. About your podcast, because haven't you been doing some deeper looking into the book on your podcast?
Yeah, so actually something I had always dreamed about with this book was doing a podcast where I got to walk through the themes of each chapter in conversation with someone. And it was just something that I couldn't pull off in 2018, too much going on. And then I just was like, oh, well, maybe for my next book. And then actually, because of George Floyd's death and this resurgence of interest, I felt like there was an opportunity to actually produce the podcast in having these conversations. And I've gotten to talk to a really amazing list of people. I'm not sure we've mentioned this in this conversation, but our daughter Penny has Down syndrome. And so yes, I've been thinking about race and class when it comes to social divisions, but my most intimate personal experience of both division, but also of human connection across kind of identity markers would be through our daughter Penny, who has Down syndrome. So the podcast has given me a way to explore all of those different themes and to talk with a really wide array of people. I talked to a guy named Jamar Tisby about the history. He's a Black scholar who's written a book about the history of the white church and complicity in racism. I've gotten to talk to Micah Boyette, who's another Inc. member who also has a child with Down syndrome, about what it means to receive the gift of the life that has been given to you and to your family. And, on down the list of really incredible, thoughtful people on a whole array of topics. But the hope is that this podcast is, again, looking at what does it mean to enter into the muck of our political moment, our social divisions, but to do so with love, with humility, with the hope of healing and getting to be a part of that.
How can people find that podcast?
Well, it's called Love is Stronger Than Fear. So wherever you get podcasts, just searching either that title or my name. So nobody else has my name, which is so nice. So Love is Stronger Than Fear or Amy Julia Becker. It's the 3rd season. So but it's pretty obvious that the themes are of the past, 14 weeks or something, are along these topics: race, class, disability, and social division, hope, and healing.
That's great. That's great. Well, I hope everybody will find you at amyjuliabecker.com.
Mm-hmm.
Also on wherever you listen to your podcasts. So my last question for you before we wrap up is, the name of this series is Faith, Hope, and Love During an Election. What's something that brings you hope right now?
Oh man, that's a hard question. I'm feeling a little dispirited after the debate on Tuesday night. I actually didn't really recognize until late in the day on Wednesday the degree of just like dis-ease I had with the tenor of the debate, and again, like, not so different than what I described in terms of my dad and my aunt talking about why they disagree. And that said, I really do actually have hope in communities, like back to that sense of local people being able to make a difference. I've been a part now for a couple of months I'm a part of it. I've been on the board of a local arts and education organization here in our town. And the chair of the board asked me to head a connections committee. And over the course of the past couple of years, I've been getting to know some people in a local city. And I live in a predominantly white town. I've been getting to know some people who are people of color, who are Black, biracial, et cetera. And this connections committee is getting together to say, how can this arts organization do programs that bring kids together from these diverse communities in a way that is like meaningful, sustained, and mutual. So that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. I mean, this is an amazing group of people who are really connected in these different local places. And all of us would say there's a history that's somewhat tragic as far as why we don't live in the same town. But what can we do about that right now? Well, we can start to form connections. We can change how the next generation does it. Potentially, we can change how we do it. But starting there, and I think there are efforts like that when it comes to education and when it comes to politics and voter registration and when it comes to zoning laws and all over the place. And I have more faith in the American people, not just as individuals, but especially in terms of communities, church communities and other faith communities, school communities. Many of us are just going to retreat and only want to take care of ourselves or our tribes. But many of us, and I do think this is also like deeply embedded in the American story, are going to actually put ourselves out for the other who is close by. And so I have great hope that we will be doing that for one another more and more. And I'm glad to have this like little taste of that myself.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And I love that everyone's coming together around the arts, right? I mean, that's another really healing thing and a way to, elevate different stories and be exposed to just each other's imaginations in a beautiful way. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with me today. And
thank you for having me.
And I do hope people will find your podcast and definitely look at White Picket Fences and your other 3 books. And thanks for being here.
Great to see you.